Hi, welcome to the Leesburg Public Library. Today's presentation, Haunted Ocala National Forest, is being presented by Chris Balzano. Christopher Balzano is a writer, researcher, folklorist, and current host of the podcast Tripping on Legends. He has been documenting the unexplained since 1994 and has been a fixture in the paranormal world through his books, articles, and his work as the director of Massachusetts Paranormal Crossroads and Tripping on Legends. For more, you can visit www.trippingonlegends.com. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how are you today?
Good.
Good.
What got you started in researching paranormal activity?
It's funny, I was from the generation of kids who were able to watch horror movies that they weren't supposed to watch on HBO when their parents went to bed, right? I'm from the last generation of kids that were supposed to go to be asleep in drive-in theaters by the time The Exorcist came on, and yet we weren't. And so I had this love of it, and I had this, I would go to all of these libraries and just consume books on ghostly folklore. And then when I had my own experience, or I lived in a haunted location my freshman year at Emerson College in Boston, I noticed that people were experiencing things, but then when they would tell a story about why the ghostly happening was going on, they would always fall back on something I knew from a story from all across the country. And so I became obsessed with this idea of the crossroads, the place where a true haunting intersects with the stories we make up behind it.
And your most recent book, Haunted Ocala National Forest, that you're speaking on today, what did you find when you did the research, and what made you choose the Ocala National Forest?
It started in Astor. I always say I was asked to speak at the Astor Public Library, and I was amazed by A, how quickly they responded and wanted me to speak there, and then B, how eager they were to get me there and talk about the stories there. When I actually did the presentation on a folklore level, I love the fact that the entire audience, they knew all these stories, and they were telling me all these ghost stories back to me about their location. But then I knew something, the paranormal investigator side of me felt that there was something off about the location. I noticed that weird things were going on that kind of made some bells go off. I felt the same thing when I went to Mount Dora to speak there, and I said, I felt the same thing when I came here to Leesburg, and I said, there's something here that needs to be tapped into, that I need to understand better. And I had already written a book about a location very similar to the Ocala called Dark Woods, which is about a place in Massachusetts, and I thought, wow, why don't I just dip my toe in this and see what happens? And it pulled me in before I knew what was going on.
Wow. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Also, I think people are going to be interested to know that you live on Cape Coral,
yeah.
right outside of Fort Myers, on
Yeah.
the other side of the bridge.
Yeah.
And this is a week after Hurricane Ian.
Yeah.
So can you tell us how Hurricane Ian has affected your life and where you are right now?
It's kind of crazy, I'm here with my kids because they need some place to be. We've had it better than a lot of people, but it's interesting just talking. You see these shots on the news and you hear death counts. You're like, I don't want to hear the death count. That might be someone I know. I'm a high school teacher. Some of my students were on places like Pine Island that you hear about, or they were on Fort Myers Beach. Some of these places are their homes. We don't know where they are. So it affects me as a citizen, but also affects me as a teacher to not know where all my little ones are. And so it's kind of with a heavy heart that we're traveling, but it's like, you kind of push on and you hope that entertainment like this and escape like this helps people out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're very grateful that you decided to do this for us.
I'm very grateful you decided to have me back. I'm calling today's presentation Ghosts of the Ocala. I was doing an event at the Villages at the beginning of season. I think it was at the beginning of May. And someone said afterwards, they're like, well, I can only assume by how much you talk, you said everything that's in your books. So I'm not going to buy a book. I will guarantee you there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight that are in the books. It's more in depth in there. But more importantly, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, more importantly, there is so much going on in the Ocala that since I published the book, since I said I was publishing the book, I got a ton of information. Since I've published it, since it's been out, I've gotten even more. So some of the stuff that you're going to hear and see tonight is stuff that's not in the book because it's newer stuff to me. So my name is Christopher Balzano. I have been doing this since 1994. and I am obsessed with a good ghost story. How many of you guys think that ghosts are real? Okay. So I always say we can debate whether ghosts are real, but a ghost story is always real because people believe it, right? Like, don't tell my son this, but just the way we think that Santa Claus is real and the Tooth Fairy is real and these things like that, because we believe these stories, because we tell them, they're real to us. And one of the things that I lost along the way was this idea of the story is more important than evidence, than proving it. So a lot of that time since '94 I spent also as a paranormal investigator. So if you guys have watched the TV shows, first of all, I've been on a lot of those shows, but I was just like those people walking around with 17 meters in my hand, looking at little bleeps on a computer, spending time in the dark with headphones on, listening to voices on tape. And I started to realize that no matter how much of that stuff you did, it might be an adrenaline rush when something happens, but it was taking away from just the natural experience of going out there and discovering the paranormal. And so I decided to switch over to what's known as legend tripping. So legend tripping is a little bit different than investigating. Investigators are concerned with evidence, and legend trippers are concerned with experience. So let me give you an example. Any guys ever been to Oviedo? Yeah, you have? Okay, do you know about the Oviedo lights? So this is the essence of legend tripping, if you want to come up with a definition of what exactly legend tripping is. So for decades, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people would go see the Oviedo lights. Now, you can explain the Oviedo lights any way you want. Some people say it's swamp gas, some people say it's reflection, but there were these lights that would dance in the air, right? Now, originally they said it was because there was this man who had come back from war to find that his wife or his girlfriend had chosen someone else. He went to the bridge, he committed suicide, right? So these lights were his spirit still left there. People would go on the cheapest dates of all time, right? Rather than taking your girl out to the movies, taking them to the soda shoppy, you would say, hey girl, let's go to see the Oviedo lights. And you would go out in the car, you would watch, and you would essentially watch this light show. But the crazy thing was, over the years, more and more lights would appear, right? So people had to come up with a story as to why that was happening. And so they said, well, you know what's actually going on is that people are making out in their cars, and then like the ghosts are coming and they're taking their spirits away too, and then they become Oviedo lights. And then there was a Boy Scout camp, and one of the Boy Scouts got lost in the woods, and now he's an Oviedo light. And so all of these different lights were all the spirits, but it was something that people actually did. They'd hop in their car, not just making out, but just hopping in their car with a whole bunch of friends, and they would go out, they would turn off all their lights, and they would try to experience what was going on. And it was something that was so popular that the precursor for UCF, which was Florida University, Technical University, actually posted that people were going out. Hey, the art club is sponsoring a trip to the Oviedo Lights this Saturday. Pre-register if you want to go. That's legend tripping. Putting away all the equipment, going to that dark place, and knocking on that mausoleum 3 times so that the ghost starts to whisper in your ear. So as we go through some of these, almost all of these are legend trips that I've been on. And so I'll maybe throw in a little bit of my experience there, but they're all things that you guys can actually do yourself. So do you guys have a library van we can borrow? We don't, okay. So something you should know is that I am an outsider, right? My first books were about this place called the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, and I lived nowhere near it. I'm a Boston kid. That's where I was born. That's where I was raised. Bridgewater's about an hour and a half. Now, I know in Florida, an hour and a half gets you to the other side of the county, but in New England, you can cover 4 states in that amount of time. And I wrote this book, and I got criticism for it because it was like, well, why are you an outsider? What do you know about this? When I was working on this book, and then definitely afterwards, even at this event, promoting for this event, people were like, he doesn't know what the forest is. And so I thought it might be good for us to define what exactly is the Ocala. So when I say the Ocala, I mean the region, right? So I'm not just talking about the woods. For me, this exploration of looking into what is this weird thing that's going on in the forest began as a very specific, began in Astor, Florida, looking at like, hey, what's going on with this? There's something weird going on. The folklore part of my brain was going crazy, and the investigator side of my brain was going crazy because I noticed that not only were these amazing stories coming out, but people were reporting story after story after story. And what I noticed was that people got this condition that I call like the Ocala syndrome. So, for example, this woman in Gainesville, can we all agree that Gainesville is not the Ocala National Forest, right? So she had this experience where she came down and this dark person was essentially making food in her kitchen who then disappeared, right? Now, why would she tell me that story? I said I was looking for Ocala National Forest stories. Why would she tell me that story? She said she had visited it a week before. What I'm getting at is this. People who live near the Ocala feel as if they live in the shadow of the Ocala. I know people in Sumter County, Pasco County, these other places, and they say, oh yeah, I'm in the forest. I'm in the forest. They're nowhere near the forest, but I'm in the forest. And then it becomes a situation where we can all agree that there are areas of Volusia County that are. So is some place like Deltona living in the shadow of it. So some of these stories that I'm going to tell and that are in the book, some people might say, like in the strictest sense, they are not part of the forest, right? If we look over here, I've got Gainesville, Florida, a haunting from Gainesville. I've got a haunting from an amazing one from Deltona, and people would probably say, that's not the forest. But I would argue because when I talk to these people and I ask them why they think these stories are true, they always say because there's something dark in the woods, even if they live on the beach. So now that we kind of have like a working definition on it, let's talk about someplace that already someone has said is kind of given a look as not being in the forest, and that would be Deltona. How many of you guys have ever been to Deltona? You've been everywhere. I'm hanging out with you. Seriously, what are you doing after the show? So, like I said, when I am a folklorist, and so I always say I'm a folklorist, so whenever you see me coming over here, it's usually because I'm looking at my notes because I'm horrible with facts. This is one of those stories that it's really difficult to figure out what is causing what, right? We have these two different locations that are right connected next to each other, and no one's quite sure if what's happening in the cemetery is haunting the school, or what's happening in the school is haunting the cemetery. So this is Austin Cemetery, and it's right next to Pine Ridge. Make sure I get my school right now. It's right next to Pine Ridge High School. Pine Ridge High School was built in the 1990s, and it was a place of tragedy from the very start. During the creation of the actual school, it said that 2 men died working on it. One person died during the construction. It was a free construction accident, and the other person who died was working on the elevators. Now, I work in a high school. I know never to use that elevator because notoriously they're crazy. But this man is seen, a dark figure is seen getting in and out of the elevator at random times. Now, people are not allowed to use it unless they're staff or whatever, and people actually call out and be like, hey, you can't. And he'll go into the elevator, and then they'll catch up to him, and he'll be completely gone. But that's not the weirdest haunting at the school. If you remember back in the day, a big part of the school day are the school announcements, right? The principal comes on, welcome everybody, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Over the course of the day, announcements are being made. Of course, over the intercom system is usually where you have the bells that are going off. At Pine Ridge High School, you never know when the bell is going to go off. There seems to literally be a ghost in the machine, right? Kids will be in the middle of class and all of a sudden the bell will go off. They'll get up because that's what kids do, even though they know it's not the right bell. And they'll be told, sit down, sit down, sit down. You know, that's just elevator man. Like kids have responded back to me that they know this, that this is elevator man. But more often than not, it comes in the form of a low voice, almost a grumble, that people can't quite make out what they're saying. They know that someone's talking. So the principal will be there. Don't forget, today we've got this. But underneath, there'll be like a, And the kids like all listen, they kind of strain to hear it, but no one can exactly tell what the person is saying. This happens almost on a weekly basis. They've tried to rewire the system. They've tried to figure out what's going on. They've tried to see whether it's somehow picking up a different frequency. They've tried all these things for the past 20, 25 years. Nothing seems to help it, right? And as that whole time is going on, this weird man is still seen walking the halls. People say, now, I'm a high school teacher, like I said, that bell rings at 2 o'clock and I'm allowed, my contract hours are over, I'm already 1 foot in the in the parking lot. People at Pine Ridge don't go, they don't leave, or they leave as soon as the school begins, because they say, if you're at the school working, whether you're a coach, whether you're doing drama class and it's after dark, it's almost guaranteed that you will have these eyes on you and you'll feel as if someone's watching you, and you'll actually see a dark person walking up and down the halls. So what is it? Is it this guy who actually died in the location? Could that be the person who's haunting the school? That's the logical choice. But if you ask some people who are in the know, they say it actually starts with the cemetery that's right there. So this is Austin Cemetery. It was made in it was the first burials in the 1890s of the Austin's infant child. But they say many of the graves are destroyed, and so you can't really tell when the cemetery started. That's because the majority of the graves that were there were so old, and the town was just this kind of being built up, that they were just wood planks that were stuck in the thing, or rocks that were kind of chiseled that have been blown away because of storms and things like that. So no one knows exactly how old it is. If you go there, it's 100% you will know that there are different parts of the cemetery, because there's a very clear new part and there's a very clear destroyed old part. But the best is that if you can see from this picture over here, any guys ever seen Poltergeist? Yeah, it's right up against that new housing development right there. And so most people feel that that is not where the cemetery originally ended. As a matter of fact, there's a plaque that is actually on the cemetery itself that talks about the dedication of the cemetery back in the day from the original founders. It used to be called, Deltona used to be actually called Saulville, because the original people who were there, their name was Saul. So there's a plaque that dedicates it, that talks about the history of the Sauls. And one of the things it says is that, and let us not forget the hundreds of graves of the African Americans who died here, whose markers no longer exist. So within this cemetery, there's an entire other cemetery that no one knows exactly where it is. All they know is the approximate location. And the approximate location is the field and the driveway of the school, less than 20 feet away from where the elevator lies. So I always call this one the crisscross haunting, because is it a school haunted by a cemetery, or a cemetery haunted by a school? Now there actually is, if you guys are somewhat local, if you remember, there was a case where a woman by the name of Deborah Schroeder, I'm getting her name totally wrong, Angela Stout, in 2013 brought her roommate and best friend, a man by the name of James Schaefer, to the cemetery to kind of hang out. Any guys know this story? Oh, Google this later, you'll love it. She ended up, there was this whole weird thing where he was depositing her money and for all this sketchy reasons, and right at the entrance of that cemetery, she killed him, right? So she killed him. She dragged his body back home, or she drove his body back home. She chopped him up into little pieces. And she's like, nope, stop, I'm done. I'll stop with the story. But it said that if you go into the cemetery, and I've been there, you will hear the walking of feet in leaves, even if there are no leaves. And the older of the sections that you go, and you'll just hear, and you turn around and there's nobody there. And you always feel as if eyes are on you. So I'm not sure if you guys believe in that kind of thing. I know you said that you were a cemetery walker. I've been into many cemeteries. There's nothing creepier than the feeling, not only that something is watching you, but that something's following you. So, totally, this is someplace you have to put on your marker to go to. All right, how many of you guys have ever been to Fort King. Beautiful. So Fort King, depending on who you talk to, is either the worst military structure of all time, or at least the most haunted building in all of the town of Ocala, and definitely the Ocala National Forest. This was primarily built, it was originally established in 1827. It was built as kind of a buffer and kind of like the strong arm of the building which was across the street from it, which was designed to be kind of like a communication center between the Floridians and the Seminoles. Right? So this is in between the First and Second Seminole War. If there was a dispute, if something was going on, they would come there and they would say, hey, listen, I'm having a problem, or I'm having a problem on this side. And people would actually, they would help to kind of negotiate between them. And they would make bargains between them, and they would hear all the problems that were going on. Obviously, as the Second Seminole War continues, it starts to have a little bit more of a nefarious function, especially to the Seminoles. When this place was originally established, so 1835, do you guys know what the Dade Massacre is? Okay, so on the same day as the Dade Massacre, the less publicized of the two battles that happened was at Osceola, who everyone was expecting to kind of be at part of this like Dade Massacre attack. Osceola was actually at Fort King. He attacked Wiley. It said that, I find this hard to believe, but this is the number you always hear. It said that he shot him 14 times when Wiley Thompson went out to have a cigarette. So there's a great advertisement for not smoking, okay? So he's out there and he has a cigarette. He gets shot. Osceola ends up scalping him, and that combined with the Dade Massacre is actually what starts the Second Seminole War. And so what you have is in the front part of this building, on the front part of the Fort King, you have all of these people who, over the course of the Second Seminole War, were buried in that front yard. So all these people, even if they were killed kind of close by, they were brought back here and they were actually buried there. Over the course of time, this building has been burnt down, it's been broken up and moved. I mean, it's really kind of had like all of these different lives. One of the things that they did, obviously tragedy breeds the paranormal. One of the things that they did was, after the Seminole War, Second Seminole War was over, they dug up all the soldiers who were buried in that front yard, and they shipped them off someplace else. So all those people who had found a burial and found like their final resting spot, they were dug up and they were shipped off along with the people who died during the Dade Massacre to the first national cemetery in the United States. Do you guys know where it is? St. Augustine. So St. Augustine has the first national cemetery. It's right there. There are these they're called the pyramids within it. That's where the people who died near Fort King, but also near at the Dade Massacre, they're all buried there. Well, the weird thing is that a lot of those people never left. There are two great people to talk to. If you are into a good ghost story, there are three people. Come talk to me. But other than that, librarians, who are the gateway, they're the gatekeepers of information, and park rangers. Unlike police officers, park rangers don't have skin in the deal. They're not worried about being fired, and so they talk and talk and talk, and they tell you. So the day I'd gone to Fort King for a completely different story, I talked to these two rangers, and they were saying, yeah, stuff here happens here all the time. The woman who works primarily in the greeting center says that they'll just be working, and they'll hear slamming, like someone pounding and pounding and pounding on the windows, and they go out, and there's no one there. Or things that they set up, like they'll set up the brochures and stuff like that, and they'll just walk by it, boop, and it will fall down. Or, she said, every once in a while they'll hear what sounds like a tree being uprooted and slamming into so hard that it shakes the building, right? And they'll go outside and there's no damage whatsoever. There's no tree fallen. And she says those are pretty disturbing moments. But what might be even more disturbing are when people drive in and they say, hey, I didn't know there was a reenactment today, man. What time does it start? He's like, what are you talking about? Because people driving by on the very active road, Silver Springs Boulevard, I believe it is, driving on that road are constantly seeing people dressed up in Civil War gear walking back and forth along that lawn. And people actually will approach them and say, excuse me, and they'll just disappear. And it happens enough that people say that there's something really weird and that they actually avoid that location. If you have ever been there, it's completely barren. No one ever goes into that location. It's got this little plaque that's dedicated to the soldiers who were buried there, and that's it. But then there are these other darker spirits that people can't quite explain away so easily, until you realize that there's a little bit more of a history to the location. Because before Fort King was Fort King, it was potentially a burial mound for the Native American tribe that pre-existed before the Seminoles. And so essentially, when they built Fort King, they dug up all those mounds, they threw them wherever they needed to throw them, right? And so now you have essentially a cemetery that's been dug up, that's been replaced by a cemetery that's then been dug up. Now, I don't know if you believe in ghosts or don't believe in ghosts, but if something is going to make me haunt this world, it's going to be something like that. So it makes complete sense. But there's not just scary stories, because my favorite story out of Fort King, the one that drew me there, is a love story. You missed your cue. You guys were all supposed to go, ah. Okay, no, so we'll try it again. My favorite story in Fort King is a love story. And as I always say, there's nothing scarier than love. So this is what, okay. So this takes place behind the fort itself on what used to be an absolutely beautiful spring. If you go there now, you'll think it's just a swampy area. You'll think it's just a place that is kind of like, oh, they must have had rain lately, and it's just, but at one time it was an absolutely beautiful spring that was used by the fort, right? But it was also used by the Seminoles. So it's kind of like the area that you're looking at right here, this was the American side, right? So the Americans got their water from this side. The Seminoles got their water from the forest side, and never the two should meet, right? And they kind of had an informal, here's where you go, and here's when we go, and it's almost kind of like neutral ground. Even as the Second Seminole War is now kind of starting to rage. A young soldier went down to get the water, and on the other side of the water, he saw a beautiful woman. See, you knew it was coming. They absolutely 100% fell in love with each other, right? They would talk to each other from across the spring. I know my picture makes this look like it's really big, but it's not. They finally eventually kind of like met in the middle, like not in the middle of the water, because they would drown, but on the middle of the side. And they would talk, and they kind of like, they were starting to fall in love with each other. And he said, because he wasn't from the area, he's like, as soon as this war is over, I'm going to take you, I'm going to bring you back to my hometown. We're going to be together forever. And she's like, whatever, that sounds good to me. And so he would meet her by night, every night, by this spring, except for the nights when he was on a raiding party. And so with one hand, right, he's holding the woman that he loves, and with the other hand, he's literally going out in the middle of the night and conducting raiding parties on her uncles and cousins and brothers and conducting war. Well, word gets back that he has been killed, right? That the raiding party itself failed, that he didn't survive, and she becomes overwhelmed with grief. She goes to the spring, and she weighs herself down, and she throws herself into the water because she would rather be dead than be without the man that she loved. As Shakespeare taught us, that's probably not the right way to go. So he actually survives, right? He gets back to the base. Of course, anger is kind of ramped up in the base, and discrimination and hatred is ramped up in the base. And the soldiers are kind of like laughing at the fact that there's this girl floating in the water in the spring behind. And he realizes that it might be her. He goes out there. He sees it's the woman that he loves. He's completely overwhelmed. he takes the gun out and he commits suicide himself. A tragic story, made even more tragic by the fact that their souls cannot leave this location. On certain nights in December and January, they say that a mysterious fog rolls into Fort King. You know it almost immediately, right? Like, we're Floridians, we know those dramatic, I don't know about this area, but I know I get dramatic things. The fog comes in the morning time. But this is a fog that is thicker, and it seems to move. Like, it actually seems to roll in the cheesy way we think of it. And they say on those nights, people know that you can go to the spring, and what you're going to find is an American soldier on this side of the pond and a Native American on that side of the pond, and they're reaching to each other. They're reaching to each other from across the water. Their mouths seem to be moving, but no one can ever hear what they're saying. They see them start to walk on the water itself, and before they can meet in the middle of the water, they both vanish. So it's one of those stories where there are dozens of witnesses. The reenactors that go there say that, because that's when the reenactment season is, they say that they've seen this all the time. It's kind of one of those things they hush and they whisper. So it's like, whereas we know that that story may or may not be true, because it's a very familiar story to us, the haunting is true, right? Something is happening at this location, and we process it by falling back on a story that we know, such as Romeo and Juliet, the suicide that can't be taken back. I'm not quite sure what exactly is the reason for those ghosts, but for me, it's one of those stories that really kind of emphasizes one of the mottos I live by, which is, thank you very much. I've already jaded my children, so they're good. And then we have the last ghost to come out of Fort King. I love the look on your faces right now, because you're saying, what is that? And I'm sad that Della is gone, because Della is who is here, who did a lot of the artwork that you see across here. She drew the left one for me. These are the Stechini. Stechini are Seminole witch, ready for this? They're Seminole witch vampire owls. And they are said to walk the Ocala National Forest and the area between Fort Brooks, which is essentially Tampa, and Fort King in Ocala, looking to get revenge and to feed on men who do women wrong. Men in the audience, take heed. She went like, yeah! So, the story behind it goes like this. There was a Seminole maiden whose husband had cheated on her. And she had a little bit of a witchy side to her. And so she called upon this goddess known as She Who Walks the Circle. And She Who Walks the Circle gave her the power to get revenge on the man who had cheated on her. Right? And it came with a strict warning. I will give you this power, and then you have to give the power immediately back to me. Well, we all know women. They hate returning things. So what happened is that the woman kind of got drunk on this power. She enjoyed it. And so she then was like, well, you know what? This other person did something wrong. And so she got revenge on him as well. Right? And then she's like, well, and my sister said that this guy did something. And the more she did it, the more of her humanity would get stripped away. Until eventually, much like the Wendigo myth of the Western Native American tribes, she lost her humanity entirely. And she became this vampire owl, right? Now, there's enough of these women out there, enough of these Seminoles, that there's actually a coven of them in the Ocala National Forest. Now, vampires, okay, can we believe in them? It's said that by daytime, they walk the woods as these beautiful Seminole women, right? The kind of beautiful Seminole women that lure you into the woods, right? By nighttime, they are these blood-sucking owls who will feed on your blood, rip you open. Oh, I thought you were going to throw up. Thank heavens you didn't. You went like this. I was like, oh no. So they feed on the blood, they rip the men open, they pull their intestines out, and they make a stew out of them. I love a good soup, but I'm not going there with that, right? So these Stechini are said to still be active, but probably their most historic time was in 1835, December of 1835. As we've kind of already talked about, and you guys said that you know, 110 men left Fort Brooks to go to Fort King, right? So they were going to reinforce. Remember, I said there was all that tension there. These soldiers were going to reinforce the base, and so they left under the leadership of Major Dade. And on the first day, or the first night, I should say, they lost 5 men. Right? They woke up the next day and 5 men were missing. They were like, "This doesn't make any sense. What's going on?" Maybe they went AWOL. Maybe they got lost or something like that. Then by day, they're noticing that they're being followed by these 3 beautiful women, and they keep seeing these women. Hey, did you see that woman? Hey, did you see that woman? It's like, don't worry, you know, there's Indians all in these parts. Like, you know, don't. Next night, they lose 10 more. They wake up the next morning and 10 of them are gone. All along this, there seems to be things are knocked down, bridges are broken, so it's taking them a really long time to make this trek, right? By daytime, these guys, because now they're in the woods, they're freaked out, and they're seeing these really hot chicks in the woods. 2 of them go missing during the day, and then the next morning, 10 more disappear. This happened during the entire trek until all 110 minus 2 were dead. The Stachini had taken them all. Does anyone know the names of the 2 people who survived? See, it's too bad Della left. She's actually related. The most famous of them is Ransom Clark, right? He's the one that everyone knows their name. The other one, on about the 5th day, this guy, this illiterate who wasn't even from Florida, he got completely freaked out, right? And he decided that he was going to go AWOL. And so he completely gets out of there, right? And he's running through the woods, and he's staying, and he's every noise he hears, he's crouching to making sure that nothing happens. And then he's running through the woods until finally he's walking, and it's nighttime, and he's really tired, and he comes upon this entire encampment. There are 3 Stachini at a cauldron. The water's boiling. He's looking down. He's literally seeing the faces of men that he knows, dead on the ground. And he completely just hides. He freaks out. He hides. He loses his mind until eventually, weeks later, he finally crawls back into Fort Brooks and tells his story. Does anyone see a problem with this story at all? Does anyone know anything about history? The Dade Massacre was a one-day event. Oh, now you're saying it. You had your chance. Now, right? It was one single attack, right? It only lasted for a few hours. Right down there in Bushnell, right? They were attacked. This group were attacked. It is true. 3 people got out of there alive. 3 people got out of there alive. But it was essentially the Seminoles popped out of the swamp, and they popped out of the trees, and they had them pinned down. And the Americans, being Americans, were like, I don't know what we're going to do. Let's put some sticks together and build a barrier. And they're just getting shot at from the woods. And of that 110, 108 die right there in that moment. Ransom Clark and another guy, they take off together, and they go, you go left, I'll go right. They can't follow us both. And they followed the guy that wasn't Ransom Clark, which is why he survived. And then James Sprague hid under dead bodies. And then when the entire thing was over, including a person who went by and kind of if you've ever been to the reenactment, went by and checked all the bodies and killed everyone, he survived and crawls back to Fort Brooks. So why does this story exist? It's the thing that I've been obsessed with for the last 3 years since I first heard it. This is a Seminole victory, right? This is something that the Seminoles can take pride in. We won this battle, right? We essentially gave it to the bigger, higher establishment, right? And it's historical fact. It's documented. Both Ransom Clark wrote about it extensively before he passed away not too long after. James Sprague got his account as best he could out to someone else because he couldn't write it himself. People who were experiencing it all along the way, there are books that are dedicated to it. So why does this story exist? There can only be one reason for it, and that's that even if they had nothing to do with the Dade Massacre, people who know, people who walk the woods, Seminoles who walk the woods, know that the Stachini are real. And I had this story, and I was like, oh, it's right here. What am I going to do with it? And how exactly am I going to phrase this in the book? And what I discovered was that I was getting report after report after report of people who had the same kind of story. They'd be someplace in the woods. They'd be someplace in the Ocala or the Green Swamp or someplace and all of a sudden their car would die completely, right? And then they would start to hear this scratching and banging on their car. And when they were finished, when the whole thing was over, which sometimes took hours, they would look out and they all said the same thing. It looked like we had been attacked by a giant owl. And so I think there's men in the audience, please make sure you're good to your women. Women in the audience, please remember we love you very much. The stories that you hear are not necessarily true. Which makes you wonder whether this story is true. Do you guys, I feel like I should do this. Hey, do you guys like a good ghost story? Do any of you guys read books on ghosts, go to ghost websites, things like that? Have you heard of the story of Rolling Acres? It's probably one of the most famous ghost stories in all of Florida, and it takes place in Lady Lake, right? It takes place right here in the Ocala National Forest, and it's written in all of the books. So if you know Lady Lake, does anyone know how Lady Lake got its name? There are two stories. The first story is that the first settlers who came to this area, they were on good terms with the Native Americans who lived there at the time, right? It was a tentative love relationship, right? But they at least they knew each other and they were respecting each other. A woman, a settler woman, died in the water. And the Seminoles, who didn't want to get blamed for the murder, said, why don't we call it Lady Lake after her? As if that was going to keep the peace. The other story that's really popular is that they say if you look at Lady Lake from up above, like an aerial view, it actually looks like a woman's head. Now that seems like the logical explanation for why the name came about, except for the fact, how did they get up there that high to look down below to see a woman's head? So I kind of feel like the story, if it is true or is not true, at least it hints that there's something weird going on in that area. And not just the fact that it's right next to the villages, right? I mean, there's something kind of inherently kind of weird or off about it itself. So the story of Julia is like I said, it's probably one of the top 10 stories you hear all the time. You hear about St. Augustine, you hear about my good friend Robert the Doll, right? You hear about Rolling Acres and Lady Lake. So the story goes, if you drive down Rolling Acres, especially at the intersection of, I believe it's Ella Boulevard and Lady Lake, Ella and Rolling Acres, you will see a beautiful woman dressed all in white walking down the street. It's said that you can honk and she'll actually turn and face you and be like, talk to you. She's been known to get into cars, right? She'll actually stop for you. She's been known to appear in your car. Even if you don't stop for her, she will just appear if there's an empty seat, especially in the back seat. I'm not going to say anything about a woman just magically appearing in your back seat. We'll let that ride. We've got some children in the audience. But it's one of those things where it's been going on for such a long time that people have just kind of gotten used to the fact that if you're in that section of Lady Lake, you might see this woman in white walking down the street. It almost looks like she's wearing a wedding gown. And she might be, because the backstory goes that Julia actually fell in love with this man. They were planning on getting married, except for her parents thought that he was no good for her whatsoever. And so her parents decided they couldn't see each other anymore. And so he got so upset by this, he went to her house and he's like, if I can't have you, no one will. And he shoots and he kills her. And then he kills himself. Now, why she's a ghost, but he gets off so easy, I don't have the slightest idea. But that's said to be who Julia is. But then there's another story that says that Julia dumped the guy, right? Julia wanted nothing to do with this guy whatsoever. and she decided she was going to break it off with him. And once again, he comes down and he says, if I can't have you, no one will, and blah, 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 you know the story. And then there's another story which says that a third man, right, comes into the picture, and that he actually fell in love with Julia, but Julia refused to be with him, right? She wanted to be with this man she loved that her parents didn't agree with, and that he's the one who came to the road, and he's the one that killed her, and that's why she's still stuck there. Either way, let's not forget, this is a great example of the fact that you should never fall in love. Beautiful. And Julia is blamed for everything, right? It's one of those things, like I remember I talked about the Ocala syndrome. This area seems to have the Julia syndrome, right? If you're in the house and you hear a creak, people in that area say, oh, that's just Julia, right? Or if people, if they see a ghost in their house, which happens often in that area, they'll wake up, they'll see a shadow in their room, they'll say, oh, that's just Julia. So Julia gets blamed for a lot. Now, remember I was talking about legend tripping, the difference between legend tripping and investigating. The most popular thing to do, and I've done this myself, we can do it later if you guys all want, is to go to this intersection, you turn off your car, you roll down the windows, and you just listen. And eventually you start to hear a growl from the woods. Not a big deal, there's animals. By the way, the woods aren't really there, they're all houses now, but you'll still hear growling from the woods. Then you'll start to hear a cry, someone weeping. And then the crying will become more intense, and it'll become more intense, and you'll start to hear a woman screaming, stop, please stop, calling out for dad. This doesn't seem to fit the Julia story. So there might be something else going on. So let's talk for a minute about the killers of the Ocala. Now, I already said before, the Stachini are said to be responsible for all those people who disappear in the woods who are never heard from again, right? All those serial killers, all those missing people who end up dead and they never find who the body was. The Stachini are to blame for them. Well, you know who else is to blame for a lot of that stuff? These guys right here. Can anyone whose name is not Nicole name who any of these people, or my children, name who any of these people are? Oh, excellent. So we've got a Ma Barker fan in the house. Anyone else? Yeah. Charlie Manson. Good. He's hanging out with Ma Barker over there. Anyone else? Yes, Eileen Wuornos. Let's start with her. Eileen Wuornos is probably the most famous female serial killer, right? In addition to that, she's one of the only well-known female serial killers who was not an angel of mercy, right? Like most female serial killers, they poison their victims. Not Arlene. She had a gun and she was raging. So a lot of people, when I say this, they're kind of like, well, she was more of a Deltona. But remember, we talked about Deltona's in play when we're talking about the Ocala National Forest. But even more of that, she killed at least 7 people, essentially in and around the Ocala National Forest. One was found in Volusia County, but Troy Burgess, who was like one of the middle victims, was actually murdered and dumped in the town of Ocala. In addition to that, it's one of those things where you can watch all the crime documentaries you want to watch, but then you talk to actual people, right? The people of Astor knew her. All those people at Astor, they knew her. They said she used to hang around a place called Steal Around Forest Tavern at the corner of 19 and 40. They were like, oh yeah, she would be walking the streets all the time. So she was someone very familiar with the Ocala National Forest and associated with it, right? As if she was somehow being drawn. Does anyone know who the guy is who's next to her? No, not that far. You're going too far. That's Rod Farrell. The picture that's right next to her is a man by the name of Rod Farrell. He's famously known as the vampire killer. He used to split time between Eustis and Kentucky. I'm not sure which is worse, but just kidding for anyone who's from Eustis. But he famously started this vampire cult. He said he was a 500-year-old vampire. He got a legion of followers in Kentucky, as well as some here in the Ocala National Forest, who worshiped him as if he were a god, including his mother. When he came down to get one of his recruits, a girl by the name of Heather, her parents were kind of resistant to her going, was resistant with the relationship. He broke into the house essentially, or at first just to kind of take their car, and he ended up killing both of them. And then taking Heather and taking off to New Orleans, because that's where all vampires have to eventually go, unless you're a Stakini. But he's another killer of the Ocala National Forest. The two gentlemen on the top are Ted Bundy, right? Ted Bundy did not necessarily commit any murders in the Ocala National Forest, nor did his good friend Otis Toole, who's up there. However, they both served time in Stark Prison, which is part of the whole mystique of the Ocala. And then we have Ma Barker. And I could do an entire presentation. We just did an episode of it for the podcast, Tripping on Legends. Ma Barker, who's also known as Kate, I wish I had this many names. Kate Barker, Arizona Barker, Ari. She was born Arizona Clark in 1873. In 1892, she married George, which is where she got the Barker part of her name. She had 4 kids, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred, all of whom were some of the worst criminals of that time, right? They are literally like they're kind of like the Forrest Gump of Prohibition-era crime. Like you can literally follow all of them, like they were part of Al Capone. They had clashes with Al Capone. They had clashes with John Dillinger. Ma Barker herself is said to have worshipped Annie Oakley. Like all of these kind of names that we know at one time or another are associated with Ma Barker. They were part of the Central Park Gang out of St. Louis. In 1931, while serving time in jail, Fred hooks up with this guy named Alvin Karpis, and they form the Baker Karpis Gang. And that's really where a lot of this notoriety comes from. Ma Barker, they eventually, her husband, her kind of common law husband, snitches on them. They sneak down here to Florida because that's where people come to escape the law. And so she ends up in the town of, oh my word, help me. Okay, go ahead, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Yes, exactly. On January 16th, 1935, there is the longest standoff in FBI history. Eventually, Ma Barker and her son are found dead in the house. The FBI, who didn't exist, it wasn't the FBI. They're the precursor to the FBI. They end up pulling them out. They said that they were both armed, even though there have been reports that said they weren't both armed. They said there were reports that say there were no shots fired from the house. There were ones that said there were tons of shots fired from the house. There are people who say that Ma Barker is the greatest criminal mind in history, and there's others that say, what's the quote? I know, she's like, yes, Ma Barker was so slow she couldn't even plan breakfast, right? Whatever it may be, it's become known as one of the most famous shootouts of all time. And it's the inspiration for at least 4 different movies. That house is said to still be haunted, right? It's right on Lake Weir. Lake Weir? It's right on Lake Weir, and it's said that on the anniversary of the actual event, that you can hear the gunshots, that you will hear her come out. She's been said to appear to people who go to the house. The house, you have to kind of plan ahead of time. There's like months waiting list to go actually into the house, and it's never called like a ghost tour. It's always called like a historic morning tour, something like that. Although if you go in there, they'll just start talking about ghosts the entire time because they want you to know. If you are a police officer, a former police officer, do not go. She does not like police officers to be there. But the weird thing is that, once again, the Ocala draws that kind of stuff to it, as well as our good friend Charlie Manson, who does have a connection to the Ocala, because when Alvin Karpis was in jail, he actually learned to play guitar, or he actually taught Charlie Manson to play guitar. And the connection doesn't end there, because after we did the episode, we did a little more research, and we found out that When he escaped from the famous ranch in California, he went to this other ranch in Oklahoma, the same place where Ma Barker was from, and he actually ended up at a ranch owned by people that are named Barker. So whether there's a connection there, we're still trying to figure out, but it just goes to show you how much killers love this area, including this guy right here, a man by the name of a man by the name of William Devin Howell. You know he's a serial killer because he has 3 names. He is currently serving time in Connecticut for a series of murders that he was convicted for there. But many people believe that he's actually responsible for a series of murders in the Sanford area down here in Florida, including the killing of a girl by the name of April Marie Stone, who was kidnapped from Apopka, and she was taken and she was murdered, and her body was dumped in Sanford, Florida. And it's one of those things where he again completes this idea of like serial killers find their way. This is a Connecticut man with limited Florida connections. But it's this specific murder of April which has given birth to another legend of the Ocala, and that is the Lady of Shiloh. If you go to Shiloh Cemetery, make sure that you are ready to see what might be the creepiest ghost you've ever heard of in your life. You might not be able to find Shiloh. You said you're a cemetery lover, so here's this. If you go to Sanford, you will find the Evergreen Cemetery. The Evergreen Cemetery is actually a series of 5 different cemeteries. They get progressively less attended to as you go. So the cemeteries that are on the front that are facing the street are absolutely beautiful. They're well maintained. They've been in existence. They're modern. People are still being buried in them. If you go behind that, you find what's known as the Jackson-Paige Cemetery, right? Or the Paige-Jackson Cemetery. The Paige-Jackson Cemetery has been kind of rejuvenated. For decades, it was allowed to fall into disrepair. The headstones were turned over. There was vandalism all over it. It's actually one of the first African-American burial grounds in that area, right? And so it was at one time a prestigious place to be buried, right? Going through it is like going through the history book. So there's been a lot of restoration there lately. The corner man for Muhammad Ali, so the man who was in his corner who was going like, you can got it, man, here, spit in a bucket. He's buried there, right? There's Zora Neale Hurston, Eyes Are Watching God. She's not buried there, but members of her family are, including an unused grave for her. And so this is a cemetery that recently has been getting a lot of attention, and people have been restoring it. And through all those restorations, people say they can hear like this kind of crying from the woods, right? And they go out there and there's nothing out there. Oh, it's probably just an animal. And then the crying will be a little bit closer. And they're kind of like, they see, and then they, once again, just like the other cemeteries we talked about, someone's looking at them, right? But people who work at Paige Jackson say, and almost they feel like people are proud, like they're restoring the cemetery. And so it's almost got this weird kind of like, it's scary because it's not supposed to be happening, but it's good, right? They're getting a good feeling because we're doing something good. But then, behind Paige Jackson is Shiloh Cemetery. And Shiloh Cemetery is almost completely forgotten about. If you go there, you will see piles of memorials. You will see headstones just kind of thrown about. The majority of the people who are buried there, they will never be able to identify because the graves don't exist anymore. The headstones that are there are broken and cracked and unattended. They're doing a little bit more now, but it still pretty much looks as if after a natural disaster, a cemetery after a natural disaster. But then there's someone who's walking the rows looking after it. If you go to Shiloh Cemetery, especially at night, chances are that you will see a woman, kind of tall, dressed all in black, with a black flowing hood, long flowing hair, and no face. And by no face, I don't mean that there's nothing there. I mean she is a skeleton. Some people have reported that there's actually a little bit of skin still kind of falling off of the flesh if you're feeling too bad for her. But other people say it's just a skeleton that walks around the cemetery. And she puts her hands on the headstones. She seems to stop some time almost as if she's praying for the people who are there. Now the story that I said is, which is why it's connected to April, is that she was killed by a serial killer and dumped nearby in water. And they took them so long to find the body that the fish actually ate most of the skin off of her face. Maybe that's true. I've watched a lot of episodes of Bones, and I've heard of that kind of thing before. But it's said that she can't leave the place sometimes. Some people say that it's April, right? I actually was one of the first people to make these connections. April was dumped less than 5 miles away from this location. Very much matched the description. She had suffered from damage in her face. And it's really weird that I first heard this story probably 7-8 years ago when I very first started doing Tripping on Legends. And then I connected it to April. And April is a redhead. And it's really interesting because now all of the online comments and all of the online stories about Shiloh all mention long flowing red hair. Now, I don't know about you, right? But if someone has flowing red hair, doesn't that kind of tend to be like the thing that you notice about them? So why was it never in the stories before until this person? Because we take a story that we can hold on to and we attach it to a ghost story we can't explain. And that's how legends are built. So what does any of this have to do with Rolling Acres? What about poor Julia? What about them going there and rolling down the windows and all that stuff? What does any of this have to do with her, right? Because I believe it's actually not a woman named Julia that's in the woods. I believe it's two victims of the most prolific serial killer in Florida history. Don't say it. You know it right there in the blue. What's his name? You do, exactly. So this is, wow, you guys could do the presentation for me here. This is, and I always have to, that's why usually I label their names. This is Pamela Nader and Nancy Lechner. They were taken in 1966. They belong to one of the coolest named organizations of all time, the Aquaholics. They were a skin diving crew who went up to, these two ladies actually didn't know each other before this day. They went up to Alexander Springs to go for a swim, right? They both had their boyfriends with them. It ended up that it was too cold. They couldn't go swimming that day. For reasons that they're never quite clear, their boyfriends kind of go out for a walk. They come back, and both the girls disappear, never to be seen again, right? They found some of their stuff at the location. However, they've never actually found the bodies whatsoever. So what does that have to do with Lady Lake? This man right here, a man by the name of Gerard John Schaefer, has officially been stamped, we'll say, as the killer of these two women, right? So he is Florida's most prolific serial killer. While he only was serving time for 2 crimes, for 2 murders, he's thought to have committed anywhere between 6 and 130 murders. This guy is such a nasty guy. When Ted Bundy met him at Stark Prison, he went, "Hey, thanks for giving me the idea to kill 2 women at the same time, buddy." Right? This man is horrific because that was his MO. He would kidnap 2 women. He would then bring them to a secondary location, and he would torture and kill them, sometimes by hanging them from a tree. He would then oftentimes go back and visit the bodies for, years afterwards. Also, he was a police officer. He was only caught because 2 women who he had essentially kidnapped in the art of, or in the process of hitchhiking, were able to escape when he had to go on a policeman's call, so he left them hanging from the tree and they were able to escape. This is a really, really bad guy. Now, he was never convicted of these 2 women's murders, but when they served a search warrant on his house and then his mom's house in Fort Lauderdale, they found materials, they found artifacts, they found trophies both of these women in his mother's house. And so that he know that he 100% committed the murder. But their bodies were never found. Yet in doing my research, I found this little picture here, which is a patrol boat for Lake County, which was called in to look over Lady Lake because they believed 100% that that's where the bodies were dumped. So that screaming you hear in the woods, those voices calling out for mom and dad, for dad I should say, I believe it is these two women still stuck in those woods because that's where Gerard Schaefer took them. Why don't we end on a nice note? How many of you, it's not going to get any nicer, by the way. How many of you guys have ever seen the movie Jeepers Creepers? Just one of you? Okay, well now you guys all have homework. You have to watch it. This was a horror movie. It was made in the year 2001. And it, while doesn't take place in any real location, actually takes place in Poho County. They never identified as Florida, I believe, but they call it Poho County. The majority of this was shot in and around the Ocala. Let's talk about the inspiration for the story itself. So if you've never seen the movie, the opening scene has a brother and sister driving down the street, driving home for holiday. And I think it's in the movie, it's supposed to be Thanksgiving. They're driving home for Thanksgiving. They come across this church where they see this man dumping a woman into a well, or dumping a woman into like a tunnel or whatever it is. The man then they take off. The man goes after them and then spends the rest of the movie essentially torturing them and trying to catch them. And they find out that it's a supernatural being who sleeps every 23 years. He comes up. He kills as many people as he can to feast on them. He stores some for later. And some of them, he just is like, wow, you know what? I'm not liking my nose anymore. And he takes their nose and replaces it. So it's this classic horror film of teenagers being hunted down and killed. And it all takes place in glorious Poho County, supposedly Florida. But if you take it back to 1990, where the writer-director got his inspiration, was a guy by the name of Dennis Depew who lived in Michigan. And on Easter morning, this abusive husband had just about enough of his wife. He actually ends up beating her pretty much to death in front of her kids as they're kind of looking at their Easter baskets, drags her off, puts her in the car, goes to the local church, and dumps her in the well. He's seen doing this by two people who are on their way home from services, and the whole thing plays itself out. He's following them, he's honking his horn, he's trying to hit the back, and then he realizes that he's not going to catch them, and what is he going to do if he does? And they go off one way, he goes off the other way, he falls off the map, and it's not until his story is featured for the second time on Unsolved Mysteries that a hotel manager in Texas is like, wait a minute, that guy is staying here. And then there's a standoff with the police, and he commits suicide before he's ever able to take in. Well, the writer and director of that movie, a guy by the name of Victor Salva, heard that story, thought it was a really good basis for a movie, and he started to make, in 2000, he started to make Jeepers Creepers, and he kind of extended that story. Only Victor should never have been able to make that movie because he was actually a convicted sex offender. So a few years earlier, he had been convicted of sexual abuse of minors and possession of child pornography and filming that, like owning the molestation. And he actually served time. He only ended up serving 15 months, but he was a sex offender. And they didn't even realize this when they gave him the money to make the movie until he tried to recruit extras from the nearby high school and realized he wasn't allowed to be associating with teenagers. That opening shot of them driving down the street, like the infamous scene, because like the first 20 minutes of the movie is just them talking in the car, was actually filmed in Dunlin, Florida, essentially at the intersection of 180 and 40, which is where you have the high school, which is where you have the local high school. That road is actually called Tiger Trail Road. And it is probably the most infamous little stretch of road. People go there all the time, especially during the day, and they take their picture of them driving down the road, right? And all that stuff like that. except for it's a completely different place at night. At night, if you go to that stretch of road, what you are going to find are black-eyed kids. So black-eyed kids, for those of you guys who don't know, are these, they look 100% like normal children, except for their eyes are completely black. And sometimes they're even said to be glowing. And they're always looking to get inside. So people have reported black-eyed kids knocking on their front door and saying, "We need help, can we use your phone?" If that ever happens, I don't know if I have to actually make this. If a kid with black eyes ever appears at your house, do not let them in the house. But actually here on Tiger Trail Road, which is often misidentified as Tiger Tail Road, these black-eyed kids are said to walk along the side of the street. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 kids. Sometimes it's as many as 4 kids, and the kids are actually being escorted by 2 older kids, which people say they look like they're teenagers. These kids try to get into your car. If you actually stop, they'll try to like actually open the car doors. It's said that if you're driving and there's someone in your front seat, they'll appear in your back seat, right? But they didn't ask, so they can't stay. And they'll try to freak you out and try to get you to get out of the car, like leave the car. And if you leave the car, then you're essentially like kind of in their realm, almost kind of like going to a fairy realm. It's one of those things where a lot of people say the popularity of this location and these stories only came after the movie. But I found that it's actually these reports go back decades, even like longer than the movie. People have been talking about this. One of the things to do when you go there, which has only been come up recently, it's kind of like the way that the stories change and stuff like that, is that if you go to this location and you are facing the high school, right? So you're facing, essentially going the same way that the college kids are going in the movie. If you turn off your car completely, you turn on your lights, turn off your lights, turn on your lights, a dark man will appear in the distance. Sometimes this man is said to be wearing a hat, so he looks a lot like the guy from Jeepers Creepers. Other times he's just a tall, dark man who seems to be made of nothing more than thick fog. You turn off your lights, you turn on your lights, he's a little bit closer. You turn off your lights, you turn on your lights, he's closer and closer and closer until he puts his hand on your hood. And then if you turn it off one more time, you turn it off one more time, turn it on one more time, he'll appear in the seat next to you and kill you. There have been several people who have died on this stretch of road. There's at least one car. There was one car accident where the kids actually were killed. They were in the back seat and they got decapitated. There have been some other unexplained murders in that area that people attribute to this story. If you ever happen to be in that location and do that, don't worry about it because you can reverse it easily. All you have to do is this. You turn the car back on. Don't leave. If you leave, he follows. Turn the car off. Turn on your high beams. And you click it on and off and on and off, and he'll appear further and further and further and further away until you can't see him anymore. And then you can go home and smack yourself for having been so dumb to even try it in the first place. There are other hauntings associated with this. The St. James Church, which is the church that is featured in the movie, is notoriously haunted. It's said that there's this fog that rolls in. If you walk in the cemetery that's around there, not only will you see these ghost lights, which will kind of float in the air, but you'll feel an actual pull on your legs, and people have been known to go there just to experience that. Don't go there because it doesn't even exist anymore, right? The church that was featured in the movie, like many of the locations that are part of this whole Jeepers Creepers curse, was the site of various vandals. People would go there, conduct these weird satanic rituals, right? They would vandalize it, they would have fire in there, they would go there and do drugs and all stuff like that until it mysteriously burnt down. You should read into that. The town got tired of dealing with it and someone went and burnt the thing down. So it doesn't exist anymore. However, that same story exists in a different church called Wesley. It's the Wesley Church. And all the same stories. You know why? Because that never happened at St. James. It was always Wesley Church. A friend of mine by the name of Jeff Belanger is famous for saying, a place is always haunted by the most famous person that stayed there, which is why every place where I'm from in Boston is haunted by Paul Revere, right? Which is why there's like 83 places that are haunted by George Washington, right? Mark Twain appears everywhere he ever, right? So it's one of those things where Wesley Church has always been the place of the haunting. It just gets caught up in the whole ambiance of Jeepers Creepers. It gets caught up in this mystique people have for St. James Church. And of course, it gets caught up in being part of the haunted Ocala.
To see more exciting and interesting presenters at the library, please visit leesburgflorida.gov/library and also visit our Facebook page, Leesburg Public Library. See you soon.